The arrogant general reached for her sidearm with a condescending smirk, expecting to humiliate the quiet supply clerk in front of the entire assembly. In one fluid motion, she caught his wrist, twisted it with surgical precision until he dropped to his knees, then calmly drew her weapon and put 9 consecutive bullets through the exact center of 9 different targets without even looking at them. The stunned silence that followed would be talked about for years to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But let me tell you how we got there. Meet Aria Ravencrest, 28 years old, auburn hair always pulled back in a regulation bun, green eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. She worked as a supply logistics coordinator at the prestigious Thornfield Military Academy, one of the most elite training facilities in the Northern Territories. Her job was simple: manage inventory, distribute equipment, and make sure the cadets and officers had everything they needed for their training exercises. She carried a clipboard more often than a weapon, wore pressed utility uniforms that somehow looked too big on her slender frame, and spoke only when spoken to. Thornfield Academy was a place where legends were born. Generals who had shaped the course of modern warfare had walked these halls. The instructors were battle-hardened veterans with decades of combat experience, and the cadets were the best and brightest from military families across the continent. Everyone at Thornfield had a story worth telling, achievement worth bragging about, or a family legacy that commanded respect. Everyone except Aria. She had appeared at Thornfield 18 months ago with minimal paperwork and no fanfare. Her application listed a basic logistics certification from the coastal training centers, nothing impressive. No distinguished service record, no family connections, no remarkable achievements. Just another quiet civilian contractor hired to handle the mundane details that kept the academy running smoothly. The officers and instructors barely acknowledged her existence. She was part of the background, like the furniture or the filing cabinets. When they needed supplies, they would bark orders without looking at her face. When equipment went missing, they would question her competence with barely concealed irritation. When she efficiently solved problems or anticipated their needs, they took it for granted. "Hey, inventory girl," Major Thorne would call out whenever he needed something. He never bothered to learn her name, despite working in the same building for over a year. "We need more ammunition for the advanced marksmanship program. Try not to mess up the count this time." Captain Rosefield was even worse. She treated Aria like a particularly slow student who couldn't understand basic instructions. "Listen carefully, supply clerk," she would say slowly, as if speaking to a child. "The cadets need their equipment ready by 0600 hours. That means 6 in the morning. Can you handle that, or do we need to find someone more capable?" Aria never reacted to their condescension. She would simply nod, make notes on her clipboard, and ensure everything was exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to be there. Her efficiency was remarkable, though no one seemed to notice. Weapons were always clean and properly maintained. Ammunition counts were always perfect. Equipment never went missing on her watch. Training exercises ran smoothly because every detail had been anticipated and prepared for. Cadets treated her like she was invisible. They were the future elite of the military, destined for command positions and glorious careers. She was just the person who handed out their gear. They would grab equipment from her without so much as a thank you, discuss classified training scenarios right in front of her as if she didn't exist, and make jokes about the civilian contractor who probably couldn't even field strip a basic rifle. "I bet she's never even fired a weapon," one cadet laughed to his friends while collecting his gear. "Look at her hands, no calluses, no scars. Probably joined logistics because she was too afraid of actual combat training." His friend nodded in agreement. "My little sister could probably outshoot the supply girl." These civilian contractors are all the same. They want military benefits without military risks. Arya continued organizing equipment as if she hadn't heard every word. Her movements were methodical, precise, almost mechanical in their efficiency. She wore standard-issue utility gloves that covered her hands completely, so no one could see the old calluses that had never quite faded, or the tiny scars that told stories she never shared. But there were signs, small details that no one at Thornfield seemed to notice or understand. The way she moved through the armory with absolute familiarity, knowing exactly where every weapon belonged without checking labels. How she could field strip and reassemble any rifle in the inventory with her eyes closed, though she only did this during her late-night equipment maintenance when the facility was empty. The unconscious way she assessed sight lines and cover positions whenever she entered a new room, a habit so ingrained it had become automatic. She wore a simple silver pendant on a thin chain, always tucked inside her uniform where no one could see it. Sometimes, during quiet moments when she thought no one was watching, she would touch it gently through the fabric, as if drawing strength from whatever memory it represented. Late at night, when the academy settled into silence and the corridors were empty, Arya would walk through the facility with a different kind of presence. Gone was the uncertain supply clerk who fumbled with clipboards and stammered through equipment requests. In the darkness, she moved like someone who belonged in shadows, someone who understood that the most dangerous person in any room was often the one nobody noticed. The other staff members had given her a nickname, Paper Girl, because she always seemed to be carrying forms and inventory sheets. They used it dismissively, the way you might refer to furniture that serves a purpose but isn't worth remembering. The name stuck, spreading through the academy until even people who had never spoken to her directly knew her as the Paper Girl from Supply Logistics. What none of them realized was that Arya Ravencrest had spent the last 18 months studying every person at Thornfield Academy with the same methodical precision she applied to inventory management. She knew their habits, their weaknesses, their tells. She understood exactly how dangerous each of them could be in combat, and more importantly, she knew exactly how they would react when their comfortable assumptions about the world were suddenly and violently challenged. Have you ever been completely underestimated by people who should have known better? Share your story in the comments. You might be surprised how many others have walked in similar shoes. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, General Nathaniel Blackthorne would arrive for his quarterly inspection, bringing with him the kind of arrogance that could only come from 30 years of having people say, "Yes, sir," to everything he demanded. And tomorrow, the quiet supply clerk who everyone called Paper Girl would remind an entire military academy that the most dangerous mistakes are the ones you never see coming. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pattern of dismissal at Thornfield Academy had become so routine that it felt like part of the daily schedule. Morning reveille, breakfast formation, equipment distribution by the Paper Girl, combat training, afternoon drills, evening mess, and another day of treating Arya Ravencrest like she was barely worth the air she breathed. Colonel Harrison Steele, the Academy's commanding officer, set the tone from the very top. During his weekly staff meetings, he would discuss every department except logistics. When forced to acknowledge supply issues, he would wave his hand dismissively and mutter, "Just tell the clerk to handle it. That's what we pay civilians for." He had been in the same room as Arya dozens of times, but had never once made eye contact or addressed her directly. To him, she was office equipment that occasionally needed instructions. The morning ritual was always the same. Arya would arrive at 0530 hours, 30 minutes before her required start time, and begin preparing equipment for the day's training exercises. She would check ammunition counts, verify weapon conditions, and organize gear with mathematical precision. By the time the first officers arrived, everything would be perfectly arranged and ready for distribution. Captain Drayson, The head of combat training would stride into the supply room like he owned the world. "Paper girl," he would announce without looking at her, "the advanced tactics unit needs full combat loads today. 24 assault rifles, 12 sniper rifles, 4 machine guns, and enough ammunition to level a small building. Think you can count that high without making mistakes?" His tone wasn't just condescending, it was deliberately humiliating. He would often bring other officers with him specifically to watch him belittle the civilian contractor. It was entertainment for them, a way to start their day by reminding themselves how superior they were to the people who served them. "Actually," Lieutenant Porter chimed in one morning, "maybe we should double-check her counting. Remember last month when she supposedly distributed all the equipment correctly, but somehow everything was exactly where it needed to be? That was probably just luck." They would laugh as if this was the height of wit. The idea that Arya might be competent at her job was apparently hilarious to them. The fact that their training exercises ran more smoothly than they ever had in the Academy's history was just coincidence. The fact that equipment failures had dropped to 0 since her arrival was surely just chance. Major Kane had a particularly cruel habit of testing her knowledge in front of groups. "Hey, supply clerk," he would call out during busy distribution periods when cadets were lined up waiting for their gear. "This cadet says his rifle isn't zeroed properly. What's the difference between mechanical 0 and battle sight 0? It was a trap, of course. The question was designed to embarrass her. Most civilian contractors wouldn't know advanced marksmanship terminology. When she would quietly provide the correct technical answer, explaining sight adjustment procedures, environmental factors, and ballistic coefficients with uncomfortable precision, Major Kane would frown and mutter, "Lucky guess. Must have looked it up." The cadets took their cues from their instructors. If the officers treated the paper girl like furniture, then they would too. Cadet Reynolds, a third-generation military brat whose father was a decorated general, made it his personal mission to find new ways to humiliate her. "My gear better be perfect today. Supply girl," he would announce loudly enough for everyone to hear. "My family doesn't accept excuses from people who couldn't handle real military service. If there's so much as a speck of dust on my rifle, I'm reporting your incompetence to Colonel Steele." His friends would nod along approvingly. They were destined for greatness after all. She was just temporary help who would be forgotten the moment they graduated and moved on to real assignments. The psychological warfare was constant and methodical. During equipment inspections, they would deliberately mishandle gear and then blame her for providing defective supplies. They would make impossible requests with unrealistic deadlines, then express mock surprise when everything was completed perfectly and on time. "Wow," Cadet Morrison said sarcastically after receiving his flawlessly maintained equipment for the 5th consecutive week. The paper pusher actually managed to do her job again. Maybe we should throw her a parade. What made it worse was that Arya never defended herself, never argued, never showed any sign that their treatment affected her. She would simply nod, make notes on her clipboard, and continue working with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized her service from day one. This apparent weakness only encouraged them to push harder. Captain Rosefield developed a game called Stump the Civilian. She would bring visiting officers to the supply room specifically to watch her ask increasingly complex military questions, expecting Arya to fail spectacularly and provide entertainment for her guests. "Tell me, contractor," Captain Rosefield said during one such performance, "if a sniper team needs to engage targets at varying distances in a crosswind environment, how do you calculate the difference in holdover between a 400-meter shot and an 800-meter shot using standard match ammunition?" The question was so specific and technical that even some of the military officers in the room looked uncomfortable. It was clearly designed to humiliate someone who was supposed to be just a supply clerk. Arya looked up from her inventory sheets, paused for exactly 3 seconds, and then provided a detailed explanation that covered wind deflection calculations, trajectory mathematics, environmental factors, and ammunition ballistics with the kind of precision that suggested she had made such calculations under pressure many times before. The room fell silent. Captain Rosefield's face went red. You must have memorized that from a manual," she stammered. "Yes, ma'am," Arya replied quietly, returning to her paperwork as if nothing unusual had happened. But instead of gaining respect, these moments of demonstrated knowledge only seemed to anger her tormentors more. They didn't want to discover that she was competent. They wanted to confirm that she was beneath them. When reality contradicted their assumptions, they simply dismissed the evidence and doubled down on their prejudices. The breaking point came during a surprise inspection by the Academy's board of directors. Everything needed to be perfect, and the pressure on every department was enormous. The logistics requirements were particularly complex, multiple training scenarios running simultaneously, visiting dignitaries who needed special accommodations, and demonstration exercises that required precise coordination of equipment and personnel. Colonel Steele called an emergency meeting of all department heads. Arya wasn't invited, of course, but the meeting was held in the conference room adjacent to the supply office, and the walls were thin. "If anything goes wrong during this inspection," Colonel Steele's voice carried clearly through the wall, "heads are going to roll. I want every department running at maximum efficiency. No mistakes, no excuses, no second chances." Major Kane's voice was equally clear. "What about logistics? The paper girl has been doing fine with routine operations, but this inspection is going to be 10 times more complex than anything we've thrown at her before." Colonel Steele's response was swift and dismissive. "She's a civilian contractor handling basic supply distribution. How complicated can it be? If she can't handle counting equipment and filling out forms, we'll find someone who can." The laughter that followed was cold and professional. These were people discussing her career and capabilities as if she were a malfunctioning piece of equipment rather than a human being who had never failed them once in 18 months of service. Have you ever worked somewhere where your competence threatened other people's sense of superiority? Drop a comment about how you handled it. Your experience might help someone else facing the same challenge. The inspection was scheduled for the following week. General Nathaniel Blackthorne would be arriving with a full entourage, expecting to see Thornfield Academy operating at peak performance. Every department would be under the microscope, every detail scrutinized, every weakness exposed. What none of them realized was that Arya Ravencrest had been preparing for this moment since the day she arrived at Thornfield. Not because she cared about impressing the board of directors or advancing her career, but because she understood something that all their years of military training had failed to teach them. The most dangerous enemy is the one you never bothered to truly see. First real glimpse of who Arya truly was came during what should have been a routine equipment malfunction. It was a Tuesday morning, and the Advanced Combat Tactics class was preparing for live-fire exercises in the Academy's main training facility. Cadet Thompson, eager to impress his instructors, was performing a rapid weapon inspection when his rifle's bolt mechanism jammed completely during reassembly. The malfunction wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The bolt was stuck halfway closed with a live round partially chambered, creating a potentially explosive situation if handled incorrectly. The weapon couldn't be fired, couldn't be cleared, and couldn't be safely disassembled without risking catastrophic misfire that could kill or seriously injure anyone in the immediate vicinity. Captain Drayson immediately ordered everyone to evacuate the area while he called for the Academy's master armorer, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a 30-year veteran who had seen every possible weapon malfunction in 3 different wars. The problem was that Rodriguez was off base for the day, attending a training conference in the capital city, and wouldn't return until late evening. "Damn it," Captain Drayson muttered. studying the jammed weapon from what he considered a safe distance. "We'll have to cancel today's training exercise. There's no way to clear this safely without Rodriguez, and I'm not risking anyone's life on a guess." The cadets groaned in frustration. This was a critical training day that they had been preparing for weeks. Canceling would throw off their entire certification schedule and potentially delay graduation for the entire class. But Captain Drayson was right. Attempting to fix the malfunction without expert knowledge could result in tragedy. That was when Arya spoke up from the back of the room, her voice so quiet that several people had to strain to hear her. "Captain, if I may, I might be able to help with the weapon." The suggestion was so unexpected that Captain Drayson actually laughed out loud. "Paper girl, this isn't a supply distribution problem. This is a complex mechanical malfunction that requires expert knowledge and years of experience. Go back to your clipboards and let the professionals handle this." But Arya didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward with a confidence that no one at the academy had ever seen from her before. "Sir, with respect, I've seen this type of bolt jam before. It's caused by a worn extractor claw that catches on the chamber rim. If you attempt to force it, the firing pin could strike the primer and detonate the round inside the chamber." The technical precision of her explanation made everyone in the room stop talking. Captain Drayson's condescending smile faded as he realized that she had just described the exact mechanical failure with surgical accuracy, something that should have been impossible for a civilian contractor to know. "How could you possibly know that?" he demanded. "I've maintained similar weapon systems before," Arya replied simply. "The fix requires disengaging the extractor tension spring while simultaneously rotating the bolt head exactly 12 degrees counterclockwise. But it has to be done in a specific sequence, or the timing mechanism will fail permanently." Major Kane, who had arrived to observe the training exercise, stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "Contractor, even if you somehow memorize that from a technical manual, this isn't theory. One mistake and that weapon could explode in your hands. We're talking about potentially fatal consequences." Arya nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. I understand the risks." What happened next would be discussed in hushed tones throughout Thornfield Academy for months afterward. Arya approached the weapon with movement so fluid and confident that even the most experienced officers found themselves holding their breath. She examined the jammed mechanism for exactly 15 seconds, her green eyes taking in details that others had missed entirely. Then she began to work. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that could only come from years of intensive training under pressure. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess, didn't show even the slightest tremor of uncertainty. Using a small multi-tool from her utility belt, a tool that everyone assumed was for basic maintenance tasks, she manipulated internal components of the weapon with surgical precision. First, she released a tiny spring that most people wouldn't have even known existed. Then she rotated a component so small that several observers had to lean forward to see what she was doing. The movements were economical, purposeful, and executed with the kind of muscle memory that suggested she had performed this exact procedure hundreds of times before. Within 90 seconds, there was a soft mechanical click, and the bolt slid smoothly into position. Arya carefully extracted the live round, inspected the chamber, and performed a complete function check of the weapon. Everything worked perfectly. The silence in the room was deafening. Double quotes. How double quotes Captain Drayson started to ask, then stopped himself. The question he wanted to ask, how could a civilian supply clerk possess expert-level knowledge of advanced weapon mechanics, was too unsettling to voice aloud. "Lucky guess," Major Kane muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. What they had just witnessed wasn't luck. It was expertise so advanced that it made their own mechanical knowledge look amateur by comparison. The cadets stared at Arya as if seeing her for the first time. Cadet Thompson, whose weapon had been saved, stammered out a barely audible thank you. But Arya had already turned away and was walking back to her position at the equipment table, her expression as neutral and unremarkable as always, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, other incidents began to accumulate. Small things that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a picture that made the Academy staff increasingly uncomfortable. A nighttime navigation exercise. When Cadet Martinez became disoriented and lost in the Academy's extensive forest training ground, it was Arya who suggested the exact grid coordinates where the search team should look. Her estimate was accurate to within 50 meters, despite having no apparent knowledge of the cadets' planned route or any experience with land navigation. When Lieutenant Porter was struggling with calculations for an artillery training scenario, he made the mistake of asking Arya to double-check his math as a joke, expecting to embarrass her with complex ballistic computations. Instead, she quietly corrected 3 significant errors in his trajectory calculations, adjusted his wind compensation factors, and provided more accurate range estimates than the Academy's computer modeling system. During a medical emergency when a visiting instructor suffered a severe allergic reaction, Arya administered first aid with the kind of calm expertise that suggested extensive medical training. She assessed his condition, managed his airway, and provided treatment recommendations that probably saved his life. When the paramedics arrived, they complimented her technique and asked where she had received her emergency medical certification. Basic first aid courses, she replied, but the paramedics exchanged skeptical glances. What they had observed wasn't basic anything. It was advanced trauma management performed under pressure by someone with obvious professional experience. Each incident was dismissed individually. Lucky guesses, coincidences. Maybe she had looked up information in manuals. Maybe she had taken more training courses than her file indicated. But the accumulation of coincidences was becoming harder to ignore. Captain Rosefield began watching Arya more carefully during equipment distribution periods. She noticed things that she had somehow missed before. The way Arya could identify weapon models and specifications from across the room. The unconscious manner in which she assessed the combat readiness of every person who entered the supply area. The economical precision of her movements that suggested training in environments where wasted motion could mean death. Most unsettling of all was what happened during the monthly combat proficiency assessments. While Arya wasn't required to participate as a civilian contractor, she was often present in the observation area, quietly managing equipment and maintaining records. Captain Rosefield noticed that Arya's attention wasn't focused on the paperwork, it was focused on the shooters, and she was evaluating them, not just watching, but conducting what appeared to be professional assessments of their technique, stance, breathing patterns, and accuracy. Occasionally, Captain Rosefield would catch Arya making tiny adjustments to her own posture, as if unconsciously correcting mistakes she observed in the cadet's form. Most disturbing was the expression on Arya's face during these sessions. Gone was the uncertain supply clerk who fumbled with clipboards and stammered through conversations. In her place was someone who watched trained military shooters with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she found their performance adequate but unimpressive. The silver pendant that she always wore had become more noticeable too. During moments of particular stress or concentration, Arya would unconsciously touch it through her uniform, and Captain Rosefield began to wonder what kind of memory or connection it represented. The gesture was too practiced, too meaningful to be random. Late one evening, when Captain Rosefield was working late in her office, she happened to look out her window toward the supply building. In the dim light, she could see Arya moving through the armory with a different kind of presence entirely. There was no clipboard, no fumbling uncertainty, no hesitation. She moved through the weapons storage area like someone who belonged there. Someone who understood exactly what each piece of equipment could do and how to use it most effectively. Have you ever noticed that the people who know the most are often the ones who say the least? Share a time when someone's quiet competence surprised you. It might help others recognize the hidden experts in their own lives. The pieces were slowly falling into place, creating a picture that none of them wanted to acknowledge. But the biggest revelation was still to come, and it would arrive wearing the uniform of a general who had spent 30 years believing that respect was something you could demand rather than something you had to earn. That evening, alone in her small quarters on the civilian housing block, Arya sat on the edge of her narrow bed, holding a photograph that she kept hidden in a locked metal box beneath her uniforms. The image was creased from years of handling, its edges worn soft from countless careful touches. It showed a woman in military dress uniform, standing at attention with the kind of bearing that commanded respect from across a room. Colonel Lydia Shadowstrike Ravencrest had been a legend in the special operations community, long before most people at Thornfield Academy had even enlisted. During the border conflicts of the previous decade, her name had been whispered in briefing rooms and tactical planning sessions with the kind of reverence usually reserved for mythical figures. She could infiltrate enemy positions that were considered impregnable, eliminate targets that other operatives couldn't even locate, and extract vital intelligence from situations where failure meant not just mission compromise, but international incidents. But Lydia Ravencrest's greatest skill wasn't killing, it was prevention. Her specialty was identifying threats before they fully materialized and neutralizing them with surgical precision that avoided larger conflicts. She had prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks, stopped 2 assassination attempts on foreign diplomats, and single-handedly dismantled a weapons trafficking network that had been operating for over a decade. The silver pendant that Arya wore was her mother's dog tags, engraved with the simple words, L. Ravencrest, service before self. But more than identification, those tags represented a philosophy that had shaped every aspect of Arya's upbringing. From the age of 6, Arya's childhood had been unlike anything her peers at Thornfield could imagine. While other children were learning to ride bicycles, she was learning to read topographical maps. While they were playing video games, she was practicing marksmanship with air rifles, developing the steady breathing and precise muscle control that would later allow her to place shots with mathematical accuracy. While they were attending birthday parties, she was learning advanced first aid techniques, battlefield medicine, and how to remain calm under pressure that would break most adults. Excellence isn't about being better than other people. Little Falcon, her mother would say during their early morning training sessions. The nickname had stuck, Little Falcon, for the sharp eyes that could spot details others missed, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. Excellence is about being better than you were yesterday, and using that improvement to protect people who can't protect themselves. Training had never felt like work because it came with stories. Stories of missions where split-second decisions saved innocent lives. Stories of teammates who trusted each other with everything because they had proven themselves reliable under impossible circumstances. Stories of the satisfaction that came from serving something larger than yourself, even when nobody would ever know what you had done. Lydia Ravencrest had taught her daughter that the most dangerous people in any situation weren't the ones who made the most noise. They were the ones who understood exactly what was happening while everyone else was still figuring out there was a problem. Invisibility is the ultimate tactical advantage, she would explain while teaching Arya how to move through environments without being noticed. People can't defend against threats they don't see coming. By the time Arya was 16, she could outshoot most military instructors, had memorized the specifications and maintenance procedures for dozens of weapon systems, and could perform field medical procedures that would challenge experienced combat medics. But more importantly, she had internalized the mindset that her mother considered essential for anyone trusted with deadly skills: the absolute commitment to use those abilities only in service of protecting others. The training had intensified during Arya's final years of high school. Weekend camping trips became multi-day survival exercises in hostile terrain. Family vacations involved visiting remote locations where Lydia would set up complex tactical scenarios that required her daughter to demonstrate everything she had learned about infiltration, reconnaissance, and threat assessment. The world is full of people who want to hurt others for personal gain, Lydia explained during one particularly challenging exercise where Arya had to locate and neutralize simulated threats while protecting mock civilians. Most of them succeed because good people either don't see them coming or don't know how to stop them. Our job is to be the exception. Arya had planned to follow in her mother's footsteps, enlisting in special operations after completing advanced military training. Her test scores were exceptional, her physical conditioning was superior to most active duty personnel, and her psychological evaluations indicated the kind of mental resilience required for the most demanding assignments. Several elite units had already expressed interest in recruiting her, but 3 years ago, everything had changed in a single devastating moment. The mission that killed Colonel Lydia Ravencrest was still classified, but Arya knew enough about the circumstances to understand that her mother had died doing exactly what she had always done, putting herself at risk to protect people who would never know her name. Intelligence reports suggested that she had successfully prevented a major terrorist attack on a civilian target, but the cost had been her own life. The funeral had been closed casket, attended by officials who couldn't discuss the details of how or why Lydia Ravencrest had died. The eulogy spoke in vague terms about service to country and ultimate sacrifice, but Arya knew the truth. Her mother had been killed because someone had discovered who she really was and had used that knowledge against her. Standing beside her mother's grave, 19 years old and facing a future that suddenly felt empty of purpose, Arya had made 2 promises. First, she would never use her training in service of any organization that might put her in situations where her identity could be compromised and used against innocent people. Second, she would find a way to honor her mother's legacy of protection without putting herself in the spotlight that had ultimately proven fatal. The decision to work in civilian logistics had been strategic, not random. Military support roles would allow her to help train the next generation of soldiers without revealing her own capabilities or drawing the kind of attention that had cost her mother's life. She could serve the mission of protection while maintaining the invisibility that her mother had taught her was the ultimate tactical advantage. For 18 months at Thornfield Academy, Arya had successfully maintained her cover while quietly ensuring that cadets and officers received the best possible training support. Every piece of equipment was maintained to standards that exceeded military specifications. Every training exercise was supplied with precisely the resources needed for maximum educational value. Every potential safety hazard was identified and addressed before it could become a problem. She had been content with this arrangement, finding satisfaction in knowing that her work was making future soldiers more effective and better prepared for the challenges they would face. The dismissive treatment from Academy personnel was simply the price of maintaining her cover, a small inconvenience compared to the larger purpose she was serving. But tonight, studying the photograph of her mother and touching the dog tags that had become her most treasured possession, Arya felt something she hadn't experienced since the funeral 3 years ago, the stirring of a more direct kind of purpose. General Nathaniel Blackthorne's reputation preceded him wherever he went, and none of what Arya had learned about him suggested that he was the kind of leader her mother would have respected. His service record was impressive on paper: multiple combat deployments, successful command positions, steady advancement through the ranks. But the stories that circulated among people who had served under him painted a different picture entirely. Blackthorne was known for his arrogance, his tendency to berate subordinates publicly, and his belief that respect was something that could be demanded rather than earned. More troubling were the reports of his treatment of female personnel, a pattern of dismissive behavior, inappropriate comments, and the kind of casual harassment that he seemed to consider his privilege as a senior officer. Tomorrow, General Blackthorn would arrive at Thornfield Academy, expecting to be impressed by everything he saw and treated with the deference he believed his rank entitled him to receive. He would probably barely acknowledge the existence of civilian contractors like the supply clerk who managed logistics, viewing people like her as beneath his notice. What he wouldn't realize was that Colonel Lydia Ravencrest's daughter had spent 3 years learning how to hide in plain sight, and that every lesson her mother had taught her about patience, precision, and protection was about to be put to the ultimate test. The photograph went back into the metal box, which was locked and returned to its hiding place beneath her uniforms. Tomorrow would require the paper girl to continue playing her role perfectly. But if General Blackthorn proved to be the kind of leader who abused his authority to harm others, he was going to discover that some people were far more dangerous than they appeared. Have you ever carried forward the lessons of someone who believed in you, even when others couldn't see your potential? Share how their guidance shaped who you became. Sometimes the most powerful inheritances aren't money or possessions, but the wisdom that lives on through our actions. The little falcon was ready to spread her wings. General Nathaniel Blackthorn arrived at Thornfield Academy at exactly 0800 hours, 15 minutes earlier than scheduled, because he enjoyed catching people unprepared. His convoy of black vehicles swept through the main gate with the kind of theatrical precision designed to remind everyone that someone very important had just entered their domain. The general himself emerged from the lead vehicle like a force of nature, 6 feet 2 inches of pressed uniform, polished insignia, and barely contained arrogance that seemed to fill every space he entered. Colonel Steele and his entire senior staff were lined up in perfect formation to greet him, despite having received less than 10 minutes' notice of his early arrival. The scramble to prepare for his unexpected timing had created exactly the kind of chaos that Blackthorn seemed to feed on. He walked down the receiving line with the measured pace of someone who knew that every second of delay increased the anxiety of the people waiting for his attention. Colonel Steele, Blackthorn's voice carried the authority of someone who had never been contradicted. I trust this inspection will demonstrate the kind of excellence that justifies the considerable resources invested in this academy. Absolutely, General, Colonel Steele replied, though sweat was already forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Every department has been prepared for your evaluation. We're confident that you'll find our operations exceed all standards. Blackthorn's smile was cold and calculating. We'll see about that. I've reviewed your recent performance reports, and there are some concerning trends that need to be addressed. Efficiency ratings have been too consistent. That usually means someone is hiding problems rather than solving them. The inspection began immediately, with Blackthorn moving through each department like a predator searching for weakness. He found fault with everything. Training schedules were too rigid. Equipment maintenance logs were too detailed. Cadet performance evaluations were too positive. His entourage of aide-de-camps followed behind him, furiously taking notes on every criticism and observation. By mid-morning, Blackthorn had reduced 3 department heads to near panic and left a trail of demoralized staff members wondering how they had suddenly become incompetent at jobs they had been performing successfully for years. His technique was systematic and cruel. He would identify the thing each person took most pride in, then find ways to belittle and diminish it publicly. The logistics inspection was scheduled for 1100 hours, giving Arya nearly 3 hours to observe Blackthorn's behavior patterns and prepare for what she knew would be an inevitable confrontation. She watched from various vantage points as he berated Captain Rosefield for excessive attention to detail, mocked Major Kane's combat experience as outdated and irrelevant, and suggested that Lieutenant Porter's training methods were too gentle for the realities of modern warfare. But it was Blackthorn's treatment of the female personnel that revealed the true nature of his character. He consistently interrupted women when they were speaking, dismissed their contributions with condescending smiles, and made comments about their appearance that were inappropriate even by the relaxed standards of military culture. When Captain Rosefield attempted to explain a new training protocol, Blackthorn cut her off with, "Sweetheart, maybe you should stick to things you understand and let the men handle the complex." Strategic thinking. The pattern was clear. Blackthorn was the kind of leader who maintained his authority through intimidation and humiliation, particularly targeting anyone he perceived as vulnerable or unable to fight back effectively. He was exactly the kind of person her mother had dedicated her life to stopping, someone who abused power to harm others while hiding behind legitimate authority. When Blackthorn finally arrived at the logistics department, Arya was ready. She had arranged the supply area according to regulations that exceeded even Thornfield's elevated standards. Every weapon was positioned precisely, every piece of equipment was maintained to factory specifications, and every document was organized with the kind of mathematical precision that would be impossible to criticize legitimately. If Blackthorn wanted to find fault with her work, he would have to fabricate problems rather than identify real ones. Colonel Steele made the introductions with obvious nervousness. "General, this is our logistics coordinator, Miss Ravencrest. She's been managing our supply operations for the past 18 months with exceptional efficiency." Blackthorn barely glanced in Arya's direction, his attention focused on the arranged equipment. "Civilian contractor?" he asked dismissively. "Yes, sir. Miss Ravencrest handles all of our inventory management, equipment maintenance, and distribution coordination." For several minutes, Blackthorn moved through the supply area with the focused intensity of someone determined to find something wrong. He inspected weapons, checked documentation, and examined storage procedures with increasingly obvious frustration. Everything was perfect, not just adequate, but superior to anything he had seen during previous inspections. Finally, he turned his attention to Arya herself, studying her with the kind of calculating assessment he might use on a piece of defective equipment. "You," he said, his voice carrying the expectation of immediate obedience, "explain to me why a civilian contractor is handling military equipment that requires security clearances." Arya looked up from her clipboard, meeting his gaze with the steady composure that had characterized all of her interactions at Thornfield. "Sir, all civilian logistics personnel are required to undergo background checks and security briefings before being authorized to handle military equipment. My clearance documentation is available for review if you require verification." The answer was professional, factual, and completely appropriate. But Blackthorn seemed annoyed by her competence rather than impressed by it. He stepped closer, using his physical presence in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "I don't like the idea of civilian contractors handling weapons that could end up in combat zones," he continued, his tone becoming more aggressive. "How do I know you understand the responsibility that comes with maintaining equipment that soldiers depend on for their lives?" "I understand the responsibility completely, sir," Arya replied quietly. "Every piece of equipment is maintained according to technical specifications, designed to ensure reliability under combat conditions." Blackthorn's expression darkened. Her calm professionalism was clearly not the reaction he had expected or wanted. He fed on fear and uncertainty, and Arya's steady composure was denying him the psychological dominance he craved. "Really?" he said, his voice taking on the mocking tone that had become his signature throughout the morning. "And what exactly qualifies a supply clerk to make determinations about combat readiness?" The question was designed to humiliate her in front of the assembled staff. Colonel Steele and the other officers watched with obvious discomfort, but none of them would dare challenge a general's behavior, even when it crossed obvious lines of professional conduct. Arya paused for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to consider her response, not long enough to appear uncertain. "General, I ensure that equipment meets the technical standards established by the manufacturers and military specifications. Soldiers deserve equipment they can depend on. The answer was perfect, respectful, accurate, and impossible to argue with. But it was also confident in a way that Blackthorn found infuriating. He was accustomed to reducing people to stammering uncertainty, and her composed responses were challenging his authority in a way that he couldn't tolerate. "You know what I think?" Blackthorn said, stepping even closer until he was invading her personal space completely. "I think civilian contractors shouldn't be anywhere near military equipment. I think people who haven't earned the right to wear the uniform shouldn't be trusted with tools that real soldiers depend on." The room fell silent. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that went far beyond a normal inspection. Blackthorn was engaging in deliberate harassment, using his rank to bully someone who couldn't fight back through normal channels. But what Blackthorn didn't realize was that Arya had been preparing for this exact moment since the day she decided to honor her mother's legacy through service rather than spectacle. Every lesson about patience, every training session about reading opponents, every conversation about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves had led to this confrontation. "General," Arya said quietly, "I believe that anyone who serves others deserves respect, regardless of the uniform they wear." The words were simple, but they carried implications that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't showing the fear that Blackthorn expected. Instead, she was quietly standing her ground in a way that suggested she understood exactly what kind of person he was and wasn't impressed by it. Blackthorn's face flushed red. In his world, subordinates, especially civilian contractors, especially women, didn't challenge his statements or imply criticism of his behavior. The fact that she was doing so calmly and professionally only made it more infuriating. "You think you can lecture me about service?" he demanded, his voice rising to a level that was completely inappropriate for the setting. "You think some supply clerk who's never faced real danger has something to teach a general about respect?" The confrontation was escalating exactly as Arya had predicted it would. Blackthorn was revealing his true character, demonstrating the kind of abuse of authority that her mother had spent her career fighting against. But more importantly, he was creating the circumstances that would justify what came next. "No, sir," Arya replied, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "I don't think I have anything to teach you." What she didn't say, but what her mother had taught her years ago, was that sometimes the most important lessons are the ones people teach themselves through their own actions. Have you ever watched someone reveal their true character under pressure? Sometimes the most revealing moments come not from what people say, but from how they treat others when they think there will be no consequences. General Blackthorn was about to learn that there are always consequences. What happened next would be replayed in whispered conversations throughout the military community for years to come. But the people who witnessed it firsthand would never forget the exact sequence of events that transformed a routine inspection into a legend. Blackthorn's face was crimson with rage at Arya's quiet defiance. In 30 years of military service, he had never encountered a subordinate, especially a civilian contractor, who refused to be intimidated by his presence and authority. Her calm professionalism in the face of his deliberate harassment was not just frustrating. It was a direct challenge to everything he believed about power and respect. "You know what I think?" Blackthorn snarled, his voice echoing off the walls of the supply room. "I think you're hiding something. I think there's a reason a young woman with no apparent military experience is working around weapons and classified equipment. Maybe we need to do a more thorough inspection of your background and your loyalties." The accusation was so outrageous that several officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Colonel Steele opened his mouth as if to intervene, but Blackthorn's glare silenced him before he could speak. This had moved far beyond a professional inspection into something that resembled a personal vendetta. "General," Arya said quietly, "my background check and security clearance documentation are all on file and available for your review. I have nothing to hide, But Blackthorn was beyond reason now. The combination of her unshakable composure and his inability to break her had triggered something primal in his need to dominate and control. He stepped even closer, now standing directly in front of her with barely 18 inches between them. "I don't believe you," he hissed. "And I think it's time to find out what you're really doing here." Without warning, without justification, without any semblance of professional conduct, General Nathaniel Blackthorn reached for the service weapon that hung in a standard-issue holster on Arya's utility belt. His intention was clear. He was going to disarm her in front of everyone as a demonstration of his absolute authority over civilian personnel. What he didn't realize was that he had just made the single greatest tactical error of his entire military career. The moment Blackthorn's hand touched her weapon, 3 years of careful restraint and hidden identity evaporated in an instant. Arya's response was so fast, so precise, and so utterly devastating that most of the observers couldn't fully process what they were seeing until it was already over. Her left hand intercepted Blackthorn's wrist before his fingers could close around her sidearm. But this wasn't a simple blocking motion. It was a combat technique designed to neutralize armed threats with maximum efficiency and minimum permanent damage. Her thumb pressed against a specific nerve cluster while her fingers wrapped around his wrist at the exact angle needed to compromise his grip strength and motor control. Simultaneously, her right hand rotated his arm in a direction that human joints simply weren't designed to accommodate. The movement was so quick and technically perfect that Blackthorn found himself completely immobilized before his brain could register what was happening to him. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Not the sharp agony of broken bones or torn muscles, but the deep, paralyzing discomfort that comes from having your nervous system expertly manipulated by someone who understands exactly which pressure points will cause maximum incapacitation with minimal lasting injury. Blackthorn dropped to his knees, his face contorting in shock and pain as his entire right arm went numb from shoulder to fingertips. He tried to speak, tried to shout orders or threats, but the precision of Arya's technique had disrupted his breathing rhythm and left him gasping for air. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds, but Arya wasn't finished. With her left hand maintaining control of Blackthorn's wrist, she smoothly drew her sidearm with her right hand and stepped back into a perfect shooting stance. Her movements were fluid, economical, and utterly professional, the kind of weapon handling that could only come from years of intensive training under pressure. "Range is now hot," she announced in a calm, clear voice that carried throughout the supply room. "All personnel stand clear." What followed was a demonstration of marksmanship that redefined everyone's understanding of what was humanly possible with a standard issue sidearm. The supply room had 9 different targets scattered throughout, the space regulation bullseye targets used for weapons testing and calibration. They were positioned at varying distances and angles, some partially obscured by equipment, others requiring shots that would challenge even expert marksmen under ideal conditions. Arya didn't move from her position. She didn't take time to carefully aim at each target. She didn't pause between shots to assess her accuracy or adjust her technique. Instead, she simply turned her body in a smooth, continuous motion and fired 9 shots in rapid succession. The first shot struck the nearest target dead center while she was still controlling Blackthorn's wrist with her left hand. The second shot hit a target 12 feet to her right without her even turning her head to look at it. The third shot went through a target that was positioned behind a stack of equipment, threading the needle through a gap that most people couldn't have hit with careful aiming and unlimited time. By the fourth shot, everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. By the 6th shot, the silence was so complete that the only sounds were the precise crack of her sidearm and the distant impact of bullets hitting their targets with mathematical precision. The 7th shot hit a target that was positioned at an extreme angle, requiring her to bank the bullet off a metal support beam to reach the bullseye. The eighth shot went through a target that was nearly 30 feet away and partially obscured by shadow. The ninth and final shot struck the most distant target in the room, a bullseye. That was positioned at maximum range for the available space and would have been challenging for most marksmen under ideal conditions with precision rifles. 9 shots. 9 perfect bullseyes. 9 demonstrations that the quiet supply clerk they had dismissed and belittled was capable of feats of marksmanship that belonged in military legend. Rather than routine inspections, the silence that followed was absolute. Blackthorne remained on his knees, his face pale with shock and his right arm still numb from Arya's precisely applied pressure point technique. He stared up at her with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered by reality. Colonel Steele stood frozen with his mouth hanging open, unable to process the contradiction between the woman he thought he knew and the expert who had just demonstrated skills that exceeded anything in his 30 years of military experience. Captain Rosefield was examining the targets with the kind of awe usually reserved for natural phenomena. Each shot had struck the exact mathematical center of its respective bullseye, with precision that defied conventional understanding of human capabilities. Major Kane was staring at Arya's shooting stance, recognizing the technique but unable to reconcile it with his assumptions about civilian contractors and supply clerks. The form was textbook perfect, but it was the kind of textbook that was only available to elite special operations units. Lieutenant Porter was mentally reviewing every interaction he had ever had with Arya, suddenly understanding that every question he had asked, every condescending comment he had made, had been heard and evaluated by someone whose expertise made his own training look amateur by comparison. But it was the expression on Arya's face that would haunt them most. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, no pride in her demonstration of superior skill. Instead, there was only the calm professionalism of someone who had done exactly what the situation required. Nothing more, nothing less. She safetied her weapon and returned it to its holster with the same fluid precision she had used to draw it. Then she looked down at Blackthorne, who was still kneeling in front of her with his wrist held in her unbreakable grip. "General," she said quietly, "I believe you were questioning my qualifications." The words were spoken without malice, without mockery, without any emotional inflection whatsoever. But they carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of quiet dominance that comes not from rank or position, but from demonstrated superiority so complete that it rendered traditional hierarchies meaningless. Blackthorne tried to speak, tried to reassert his authority, tried to find some way to recover from the most complete humiliation of his career. But the words wouldn't come. For the first time in 30 years, General Nathaniel Blackthorne had encountered someone whose capabilities so exceeded his own that his usual tactics of intimidation and dominance were not just ineffective, they were laughably inadequate. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character was revealed in a way that changed everything? Sometimes the quiet ones aren't hiding because they're weak. They're hiding because they're strong enough to know when strength should be concealed. The little falcon had spread her wings, and everyone in the room was about to learn exactly what that meant. The transformation in the room was immediate and absolute. In the span of less than 30 seconds, Arya Ravencrest had gone from dismissed supply clerk to the most dangerous person anyone at Thornfield Academy had ever encountered. The implications of what they had just witnessed were still sinking in, but the shift in power dynamics was unmistakable. General Blackthorne remained on his knees, his face cycling through expressions of shock, humiliation, and dawning recognition of just how catastrophically he had misjudged the situation. His right arm was beginning to regain sensation, but the psychological damage was complete and irreversible. In front of a room full of witnesses, he had been neutralized by someone he had dismissed as beneath his notice. "Ma'am," he whispered hoarsely, the word carrying more genuine respect than he had shown to anyone in years, Would you please release my wrist?" Arya looked down at him with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout their entire interaction. Without drama, without gloating, she simply opened her hand and stepped back, allowing him to slowly regain his footing. The gesture was almost gentle, which somehow made it even more devastating to his ego. Colonel Steele was the first to break the stunned silence. "Miss Ravencrest," he began, then stopped and corrected himself with obvious effort. "I believe we need to discuss your background and qualifications in considerably more detail." "Yes, sir," Arya replied simply, straightening her uniform and checking that her weapon was properly secured. "I'm available for any briefings or discussions you feel are necessary." But before Colonel Steele could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary, Colonel." Everyone turned to see Master Sergeant Patricia Hawkins, the Academy's senior enlisted advisor, standing in the doorway with an expression of recognition that bordered on reverence. Hawkins was a 30-year veteran who had served in every major conflict of the past 3 decades. She had seen legendary soldiers in action, had trained alongside elite operatives, and had developed an eye for recognizing genuine expertise versus military theater. Her opinion carried more weight with the Academy's personnel than most officers realized. "Sergeant Hawkins?" Colonel Steele asked, clearly confused by her sudden appearance and formal tone. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to speak with Miss Ravencrest privately." Hawkins' eyes never left Arya's face, and there was something in her expression that suggested she understood exactly who they were dealing with. "I believe there are some details about her service record that need to be clarified." The conversation that followed in Colonel Steele's private office was brief and conducted in voices too quiet for others to overhear, but the result was visible to everyone when they emerged 20 minutes later. Colonel Steele's demeanor toward Arya had completely changed. Gone was the casual dismissal and barely acknowledged existence. In its place was the kind of respectful attention he usually reserved for visiting dignitaries and superior officers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Steele announced to the assembled staff, his voice carrying an authority that demanded absolute attention, "I want to make something very clear. Miss Ravencrest has been providing services to this academy that go far beyond her official job description. Her expertise and dedication have been significantly underappreciated." General Blackthorne, who had spent the past 20 minutes in humiliated silence, stepped forward with obvious effort. His face was still pale, and his right arm hung slightly awkwardly at his side, but he managed to maintain his military bearing despite the circumstances. "Miss Ravencrest," he said, each word clearly difficult for him to speak, "I owe you an apology. My behavior was unprofessional and completely inappropriate. You have demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything I expected to encounter during this inspection." The apology was stilted and obviously painful for him to deliver, but it was also genuine. The man who had spent the morning belittling everyone around him was now acknowledging that he had made a fundamental error in judgment that had cost him any credibility he might have had with the Academy's staff. "Thank you, General," Arya replied with the same calm professionalism that had characterized all of her interactions. "I understand that first impressions can be misleading." Over the following days, word of the incident spread throughout Thornfield Academy with the kind of velocity that only truly extraordinary events can generate. But rather than becoming a source of gossip or entertainment, the story took on an almost reverent quality. Personnel who had witnessed the demonstration found themselves describing it in hushed tones, as if they had been present for something approaching the miraculous. The change in how Arya was treated was immediate and comprehensive. Officers who had previously barked orders at her without looking up now approached her with requests rather than demands. Cadets who had dismissed her as irrelevant began asking respectful questions about equipment specifications and maintenance procedures. The nickname, "Paper Girl," disappeared entirely, replaced by the more formal Miss Ravencrest. or among the more perceptive personnel. Simply ma'am, but it was the quality of the questions she began receiving that revealed just how much the dynamic had shifted. Instead of being asked to simply distribute equipment, she found herself being consulted on tactical scenarios, equipment selection for specific missions, and training protocols that required technical expertise far beyond basic supply management. Captain Rosefield, who had previously treated Arya with barely concealed condescension, approached her during the weekly equipment inventory with an expression of professional curiosity mixed with genuine respect. "Miss Ravencrest," she began carefully, "I've been reviewing the marksmanship demonstration you provided yesterday. The angle calculations required for several of those shots. Would you be willing to discuss the mathematics involved? Our advanced cadets could benefit from understanding the principles you applied." It was a request for teaching, not an order for compliance. The shift in tone was remarkable, and it set the pattern for how others began interacting with her. Major Kane, whose artillery calculations she had corrected weeks earlier, made a formal request for her to review the Academy's ballistics training curriculum. "Your expertise in trajectory mathematics and environmental factors," he explained with obvious effort at diplomacy, "appears to exceed our current instructional capabilities." Lieutenant Porter went further, asking if she would be willing to conduct informal seminars on advanced shooting techniques for officers who wanted to improve their proficiency. "We realize now that we've been underutilizing your knowledge base," he admitted with the kind of embarrassment that comes from recognizing a serious professional mistake. Even the cadets approached her differently. Instead of treating her as invisible or irrelevant, they began seeking her out for advice on equipment handling, maintenance procedures, and technical questions that their regular instructors couldn't answer satisfactorily. "Miss Ravencrest," Cadet Thompson asked during one equipment distribution session, "when you made that shot yesterday, the one that bounced off the support beam, how did you calculate the angle of deflection? We're studying advanced ballistics, but nothing in our textbooks covers ricochet shooting with that level of precision." The questions revealed that they understood they were in the presence of expertise that far exceeded anything available through normal academic channels. More importantly, they approached her with the kind of respect that genuine competence commands, regardless of rank or position. Within a week, Arya found herself operating as an unofficial senior advisor on technical matters throughout the Academy. Her official title remained Logistics Coordinator, but her actual role had expanded to encompass advanced training consultation, technical problem solving, and what amounted to expert instruction in specialized skills that weren't available anywhere else in the facility. The most significant change was in how she was included in planning, meetings, and strategic discussions. Colonel Steele began inviting her to participate in conversations about training protocols, equipment upgrades, and operational improvements. Her input was sought, valued, and implemented, with the kind of deference usually reserved for subject matter experts with decades of recognized experience. But perhaps the most telling change was in the general atmosphere of the Academy itself. The culture of casual dismissal and institutional arrogance that had characterized interactions between different levels of personnel began to shift towards something more respectful and collaborative. If someone as seemingly ordinary as the supply clerk could possess extraordinary capabilities, then perhaps everyone deserved to be evaluated based on their actual contributions rather than superficial assumptions. Master Sergeant Hawkins summed it up best during a private conversation with Colonel Steele. "Sir, this has been a valuable lesson for all of us about the difference between authority and competence. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room isn't wearing the highest rank." The Academy had learned that respect isn't something you can demand, it's something you earn through demonstrated excellence. And they had learned it from someone who had been teaching them that lesson quietly for 18 months, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal just how much they had been underestimating the people around them. Have you ever discovered that someone? You overlooked possessed extraordinary abilities that changed your entire perspective. Share how that recognition changed not just your relationship with them, but your approach to evaluating others. Sometimes the most transformative lessons come from admitting how wrong we were. The little falcon had not only spread her wings, but had shown everyone at Thornfield Academy what it meant to soar. 3 weeks after the inspection that changed everything at Thornfield Academy, Aria found herself standing in the place where her journey had truly begun, not in the supply room where she had revealed her capabilities, but in the quiet memorial garden behind the Academy's chapel, holding a letter that had arrived that morning with official military seals and a return address she recognized immediately. Envelope was marked personal and confidential and bore the insignia of Special Operations Command. Inside, written on official letterhead, but in a distinctly personal tone, was a message that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. Miss Ravencrest, your recent demonstration of capabilities at Thornfield Academy has come to our attention through official channels. We have reviewed your background and believe your skills would be invaluable to several ongoing operations that require someone with your particular expertise. We would like to offer you immediate reinstatement to active duty with a rank commensurate with your abilities and a position within our most elite tactical units. Your country needs people like you in roles where your talents can have maximum impact. The letter was signed by a brigadier general whose name was familiar from her mother's stories, someone who had worked alongside Colonel Lydia Ravencrest on operations that were still classified years after their completion. It was an offer that would have represented the pinnacle of military achievement for most people: recognition, advancement, and the opportunity to serve at the highest levels of special operations. But as Aria read the formal language and impressive titles, she found herself thinking not about the prestige of the offer, but about a conversation she had had with Cadet Martinez just that morning. Martinez had approached her during equipment distribution with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was struggling with something important. After several minutes of awkward small talk, he had finally worked up the courage to ask the question that was really bothering him. Miss Ravencrest, ma'am, I've been thinking about what happened with General Blackthorne, and I wanted to ask you something. When he was being inappropriate and threatening you, you could have stopped him at any point, couldn't you? You had the skills to handle the situation from the very beginning. Aria had nodded, recognizing the intelligence behind the question. Yes, I could have intervened earlier. So why didn't you? Martinez had asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Why did you wait until he actually reached for your weapon? You let him humiliate himself in front of everyone when you could have just shown him who you really were from the start. Question had stayed with her throughout the day because it touched on something fundamental about the choice she had made 3 years ago when she decided to honor her mother's legacy through service rather than recognition. Now, holding the letter that offered everything her training and abilities should have entitled her to, Aria understood why Martinez's question had resonated so deeply. The answer wasn't just about tactics or timing. It was about the difference between using power to elevate yourself and using it to protect others. That evening, she found herself in Master Sergeant Hawkins' office, discussing the offer with the only person at Thornfield who fully understood her background and capabilities. It's a hell of an opportunity, Hawkins said after reading the letter. Special Ops Command doesn't make offers like this lightly. You'd be working with the best people in the military, handling missions that could change the course of international events. I know, Aria replied quietly. It's exactly the kind of position my mother would have wanted for me when I was 19 and thought that the only way to serve was through official recognition and elite assignments. Hawkins studied her face carefully. But that's not what you want now. No, Aria said, touching the silver pendant through her uniform shirt. It's not. I've learned something here that I don't think I would have learned in special operations, no matter how successful I might have been. What's that? Arya was quiet for a long moment, organizing thoughts that had been developing over the past 3 weeks of dramatically changed relationships and responsibilities at the Thai Academy. I've learned that the most important service isn't always the most visible service, she said finally. When I was growing up, I thought my mother's classified missions and elite assignments were the pinnacle of what military service could be. But watching how things changed here after that day with Blackthorn, I think maybe the most valuable thing I can do is help create the kind of leaders who won't become like him. She gestured toward the window that overlooked the main academy grounds, where cadets were conducting evening training exercises with equipment that she had maintained and knowledge that she was increasingly sharing with them. Directly, these cadets are going to be officers in 5 years, commanding troops in 10 years, and making strategic decisions in 20 years. If I can help them understand that competence matters more than rank, that respect has to be earned rather than demanded, that the people around them might have capabilities that aren't immediately obvious, maybe that prevents some future version of Blackthorn from happening. Hawkins nodded slowly. You're talking about changing military culture from the inside out, one leader at a time, something like that, Arya agreed. My mother always said that the most important battles are the ones that prevent wars from happening in the first place. Maybe this is my version of that. The next morning, Arya wrote her response to Special Operations Command. It was brief, respectful, and definitive. Thank you for your confidence in my abilities and for the honor of this opportunity. After careful consideration, I must respectfully decline. I believe my current position allows me to serve in ways that are more aligned with my personal values and long-term goals. I hope you understand that this decision reflects my commitment to service rather than any lack of appreciation for the offer. The letter went out with the morning mail, carrying with it a choice that her mother would have understood completely. That afternoon, Colonel Steele asked her to join him in his office for what he described as a conversation about your future here at Thornfield. But, instead of the formal discussion she expected, she found herself in a meeting that included Master Sergeant Hawkins, several department heads, and a proposal that she hadn't anticipated. Miss Ravencrest, Colonel Steele began, over the past few weeks, it's become clear that your contributions to this academy extend far beyond logistics coordination. Your expertise in advanced marksmanship, tactical planning, and technical instruction has proven invaluable to our training programs. He paused, consulting notes that suggested this conversation had been carefully planned. We'd like to offer you a position as our senior technical advisor, with responsibility for advanced training protocols, equipment evaluation, and strategic consultation. It would be a civilian position, but with authority and compensation that reflects the actual value of your contributions. The offer represented something unprecedented at Thornfield, a civilian contractor being elevated to a position of genuine authority based purely on demonstrated competence rather than traditional qualifications or political connections. More importantly, Colonel Steele continued, this position would allow you to help shape the next generation of military leaders in ways that go beyond technical training. We believe your perspective on leadership, competence, and service could be transformative for our cadets. Arya looked around the room at faces that had once dismissed her as irrelevant, and now watched her with genuine respect and anticipation. These were people who had learned something important about the difference between authority and leadership, and they wanted her help in teaching that lesson to others. I accept, she said simply. 6 months later, Arya stood before a graduating class of cadets who had been fundamentally shaped by her influence during their final year at Thornfield Academy. They weren't just technically more competent than previous graduates, they were different in their approach to leadership, more thoughtful about respecting the contributions of others, and more aware that competence and character matter more than rank or position. As she watched them receive their commissions and prepare to lead soldiers in real-world situations, Arya touched her mother's dog tags and understood something that had taken 3 Years and one dramatic confrontation to fully realize the most important. Legacy isn't the recognition you receive for your own achievements, it's the positive changes you inspire in others that continue long after you're gone. Her mother had served her country by preventing specific threats from materializing. Arya was serving hers by helping create leaders who would prevent threats from developing in the first place. The little falcon had found her purpose, and it was exactly where she had been all along, not in the spotlight, but in the quiet spaces where real change happens one person at a time. Have you ever found that your greatest impact came not from seeking recognition, but from quietly helping others become better versions of themselves? Sometimes the most powerful way to honor someone's legacy is not by following their exact path, but by carrying forward the values they taught you in whatever way serves the world best. The arrogant general who had reached for her gun and discovered who she really was had inadvertently given her the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to prove that quiet competence, patient teaching, and service without recognition can be the most powerful forces for positive change in any organization. And in the end, that lesson was worth more than any medal, promotion, or elite assignment could ever have been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.